Hello, I'm Jim Cuno, president of the J. Paul Getty Trust. Welcome to Art and Ideas, a podcast in which I speak to artists, conservators, authors, and scholars about their work.
The story of the commissioning of Mural is one of the great stories of art history because at the time that Peggy Guggenheim commissioned it, Pollock really didn't know where his next meal was coming from.
In this re-release of one of our most popular episodes, I speak with the Getty's Andrew Perchuk, Laura Rivers, Yvonne Szafran, Alan Phenix, and Tom Learner about Jackson Pollock's 1943 painting, Mural. This is the first part of a two-part series about Mural. This episode was first released in August 2017. In 1943, collector Peggy Guggenheim commissioned Jackson Pollock to paint a large mural for the entrance to her Manhattan townhouse. At the time, Pollock was relatively unknown, and his resulting painting, titled Mural, marked a turning point not only in Pollock's career, but in the course of American art. The 8 by 20-foot painting is monumental in size, composition, and technique. Pollock brushed, splattered, smeared, and dabbed paint in a range of colors, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and pink, across the canvas. The areas in between are filled with opaque and translucent washes of white, and the entire composition is anchored with broad, dark brown strokes. The painting is mesmerizing, chaotic, even discomforting. One can't help but feel consumed by it. In 2009, Pamela White, then interim director of the University of Iowa Museum of Art, which owns the painting, asked if the Getty would consider analyzing and treating Mural, and my colleagues agreed. Conservators, curators, and scientists at the Getty Conservation Institute, the Getty Research Institute, and the J. Paul Getty Museum embarked on an extensive research and conservation project that culminated in an exhibition of the painting at the Getty in the spring of 2014. A book titled Jackson Pollock's Mural, The Transitional Moment, documents the research and discoveries. I recently gathered a few colleagues who worked on the project to recall their experience and to tell the story of this important work. Laura Rivers and Yvonne Szafran are conservators at the J. Paul Getty Museum. Alan Phenix and Tom Learner are scientists at the Getty Conservation Institute, and Andrew Perchuk is deputy director at the Getty Research Institute. We met in the Paintings Conservation Studio at the Getty Museum, the very room where my colleagues worked on Mural. So, Tom, why don't you tell us how the painting came to the Getty for conservation analysis and treatment?
Sure. I believe it was in 2007 when Pamela White, who was the then interim director of the University of Iowa Museum of Art, the owner of this spectacular painting, she came to the Getty Leadership Institute course one summer and we met. She got back in touch, this must have been 2009, and proposed this extraordinary project. I immediately went to see Andrew Perchuk and Yvonne Szafran. Andrew, I think, immediately said yes, trying to convince Yvonne and the museum itself, of course, to house and look after this extraordinarily expensive and important work of art was a very different matter. And Yvonne, perhaps you could just continue the story because we tell this together and I always like hearing your version, actually.
Well, when Tom first came to me and said, wouldn't it be great if our two departments did a project together? I said, yeah, that actually sounds interesting. We don't normally work on 20th century works of art, but it might be a fun challenge. What do you have in mind? And he said, well, there's this painting by Jackson Pollock belonging to the University of Iowa. And I said, well, how big is it? And when he told me that it's 8 feet by 20 feet, I said, I don't think so, because we had just finished actually a collaborative project with the museum in Schwerin on 2 very large paintings by Udry. And I think all of us in the studio were looking forward to working on smaller things for a change. And then the directorship at the University of Iowa changed, and Sean O'Hara came on the scene. And he very cleverly wrote directly, not just to me, but also to our curator of painting, Scott Schaefer. And Scott Schaefer came to me and said, we have to do this. This is incredible. And I think I said something like, why? And he said, if the Getty doesn't take this on, what is going to happen to the painting? And that's when it really made sense to me that this was the perfect project to come to the Getty with all the resources here. It fit very nicely into our practice of collaborations with other institutions where we bring great works of art here to be conserved and studied, both from an art historical perspective and from a scientific perspective with our colleagues at GCI who do the majority of our analysis. Sometimes we'll bring visiting conservators to help us with those projects, but in this case, the University of Iowa does not have a conservation department. So it was that kind of a project where we did the work in consultation with staff at the University of Iowa, but the work itself was done here at the Getty by the Getty.
Yeah. Tom, maybe I could ask you this question. For a long time, conservators have been working on paintings, but more recently they've been working together with conservation scientists and with art historians to develop an integrated approach with a conservator, a scientist, and an art historian. Sometimes this is called technical art history. So maybe you and then maybe Andrew can tell us about the advent of conservation science and its application to the art historical analysis of works of art.
I'll give it my best shot. And it's really hard actually to define when conservation science or technical history really begins. But probably actually going back to the early 19th century, maybe even further back, people were looking at works of art, archaeological finds with scientific tools. Most of the sort of larger established science departments in museums, these developed in the sort of mid-20th century and were often set up actually to answer very sort of important questions about conservation. Something's changed recently, and I'm not exactly sure what it is actually, because I think conservators in particular have been working with scientists for quite a long time. And maybe it's become much more integrated now. Maybe something has happened where, perhaps more on the art historical side, where the place of scientific analysis has become much more central. And it feels more than just a few individual art historians or curators who understand that understanding materiality and how things are made is interesting. I mean, Andrew, do you feel something's changed dramatically, or has this been a sort of gradual increase in interest?
Well, I think certainly when I was young, there was a much more theoretical bent to art history. And now what you can learn from the object, and especially the kinds of processes, techniques, I think are becoming really central to art history. And I mean, I can give an example from the Pollock, which is that when we first had the Pollock in the lab and you could really see it up close, one of the things that really struck you at first was that there was a white paint on the surface of the painting that was very transparent. And so in the first few weeks that we had it, I remember thinking what an amazing thing that Pollock had done by creating this transparent layer that allowed the entire archaeology of the painting to be visible, so that you could really see the painting develop over the course of his different painting processes. And of course, that thought I had turned out to be completely wrong. 100% in talking to Alan and Tom and Laura and Yvonne, it turns out that that was the one house paint that Pollock used with all of these very high quality oils, the one house paint. And that house paint, being a cheap commercial paint from the 1940s, had separated, making it really transparent. But in actuality, as you guys explained to me, the paint originally would have been like a latex house paint today. So none of that archaeology would have been visible. It certainly shows how working together among conservators and art historians can really change your interpretation.
Yeah, Tom.
Just to add one more thing, hearing you talk, Andrew, I think what's really happened in the last 5 or 10 years has been the sort of sophistication, the sort of level of the conversation has been raised up so much higher. And I think part of that is an understanding of not just whether the role of science in some of these questions, but actually to critique that science too. And I think we're getting much better at having a more equal conversation with art historians, conservators, scientists, whereas before perhaps it was looking to science answer certain questions. It really has become more about embracing the science, the technology, the imaging, and then actually not just taking results, but asking questions.
Yeah, good. Well, let's get to the painting. And Laura, you were responsible for getting started on the picture when it arrived. Tell us how you proceeded in the examination of the picture and also the treatment of the painting.
We began with a great deal of looking at the painting, and we were able to acquire a new microscope, which was particularly useful because it allowed us to look vertically. Actually, there are a number of microscopes that are developed specifically for that purpose, and we ended up buying a surgical ear, nose, and throat microscope.
And I think our listeners will also be puzzled by your looking at this 8 by 20 foot painting through a microscope.
That's really one of the incredible things about looking at paintings, is that there's much to be learned from the larger scale, but the true hidden world of a painting is actually to be discovered on a micro scale. And over the course of working on a painting and working on a surface, you come to know every single piece of that painting, every passage, every swirl of paint. And that's a process that really begins in looking and with the microscope. We were also able to do an X-ray of this painting, and that was actually a very difficult process. We have 3 X-ray rooms on site at the Getty Center and at the Villa total, and we ended up having to hire an outside contractor because the painting simply didn't quite fit properly in any of our X-ray rooms.
What would an X-ray tell you?
Essentially, it allows us to see areas of damage. It can give you an indication of how a painting was constructed. If there were changes made, it can give you some rough indication of whether a paint contains a heavy metal and is particularly radio opaque. It's really an incredibly valuable tool. It can also, in this case, give you an indication of thread count. Because paintings are executed on canvases, they actually are woven, and there are a number of different weave patterns. In this case, Mural is on a plain woven canvas. And so by counting the threads, vertical and horizontal, you're able to understand exactly the qualities of that canvas. And we were able to discover that it's made by a company called Claessens in Belgium and had a pre-primed layer, and much the same canvas is still made today. We were also, in collaboration with colleagues, able to determine that the canvas had a particular thread count and was part of a larger roll, and ultimately to determine that Pasiphae, the painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, also by Pollock, that Pasiphae was actually a remnant from the larger roll of canvas.
Yeah. So you were also interested in the original circumstances of its installation, that is the lobby of Peggy Guggenheim's townhouse in New York City. And that turned out to be an interesting story, not only helping us understand the picture and how the picture was seen when it was first installed, but because of the particular location of it. So as I understand it, in the 1970s, Angelica Rudenstein, who's a notable art historian, at the time she was a research curator at the Guggenheim Museum in the 70s, working on that collection. But in 2002, she was at the Mellon Foundation as program officer, and the foundation had acquired at that time brownstones on East 61st Street in New York City. And in one of those brownstones, or the townhouses, Peggy Guggenheim had lived. And it's for that townhouse that she commissioned the painting Mural from Pollock. So she, knowing all of that before the renovation to the townhouses by the Mellon Foundation, she documented the circumstances of the architecture. Tell us about that.
Exactly. In one of the historical photographs, you're able to see Peggy Guggenheim and Jackson Pollock in a portrait done in front of the painting. And at the base and at the top, there are small portions of what some people have at various times assumed was a frame. But in reality, what Angelica was able to prove is that that's actually molding that belonged in the house and carried throughout the upper levels of the house.
Yeah. That also helped you understand the conditions in which the painting was seen, because now you knew where the wall was relative to a raking light from a window by the front door.
Exactly. And it really gave us a great sense of what the experience of seeing the painting would have been, because it would have been in relatively low light. Although there was electric lighting in the space, it wasn't very often used. And you would have walked past Mural as you walked to the elevator at the back of the building.
The story of the commissioning of Mural is one of the great stories of art history, because at the time that Peggy Guggenheim commissioned it, she had broken up with and was subsequently to divorce Max Ernst, who was her husband, the great surrealist artist, and was in a relationship with an Englishman named Kenneth McPherson. And they took the top 2 floors of this East 61st Street townhouse. One of the features of the building was there was this long entry hall, which is where mural was designed for.
And it was a narrow entry hall.
A narrow, long entry
But how many
hall.
feet from the wall to wall?
It was 13 feet from wall to wall.
Yeah. So you could stand 10 or so feet back from the picture. Could you take in the entire expanse of the picture by standing in front of it?
I think it would have entirely filled your visual field. And one of the things we did when the painting first arrived, in order to understand what it would have been like to see it in that space, was essentially to mark out in the studio. And it really would have filled your visible field.
And by
your
studio,
visual
you're
field.
saying the conservation studio?
Yes, the
Yeah,
conservation
really.
studio.
So you would effectively had a kind of model for looking at the picture as it would have been exhibited initially in the lobby. Let's get back to the commission for the painting, because it got an extraordinary history that involves an extraordinary array of extremely important people. Andrew's already mentioned, of course, Peggy Guggenheim. But there was in May of 1943 an exhibition at Peggy Guggenheim's gallery called A Salon for Young Artists. And it was at the gallery that she called Art of the Century. And the jury for the gallery included Mondrian, hard to believe, Duchamp, Guggenheim herself, and a few others. And reportedly, it was Mondrian who convinced Peggy Guggenheim of the importance of Pollock's painting in that exhibition called Stenographic Figure of 1942. What moment in the career of Pollock? He was working at the time as a guard at the Museum of the Abstract Object.
Museum of Non-Objective Art,
yeah.
which later was to become the Guggenheim.
Yeah.
And he was living very poorly down in the village. He had shown his work around a little bit, but was absolutely not the artist that we think of today. I mean, he was truly a struggling artist. He had just come off of working on the WPA, where he was not in the mural section. He was one of the artists paid on the easel section of the WPA. And he really didn't know where his next meal was coming from. I mean, he, as you said, was working as a guard, and it was the most improbable thing imaginable for him to be given by Peggy Guggenheim an annual stipend, which was really...
It was $150 a month.
Which was...
And there's a lot of money then.
Was quite a bit of money.
It allowed him to leave his job and to begin painting the thing. Because shortly thereafter, he got a contract in July of 1943. So just 2 months later, he got this commission to paint the mural for her townhouse.
That was also astonishing. And the story behind that is, just to continue with it, she's living in this townhouse. The entryway is very important because it's the only way to the elevator that takes you up to the apartment. There's no stairs. There's no other way but this elevator to get upstairs. So her and Kenneth McPherson are going back and forth, and she says that she is shocked by Kenneth's ostentatious ideas for how he wanted to decorate this entryway. And so she finally convinces him to commission Pollock to paint Mural for the entryway. And 70 years later, it's kind of amazing that commissioning an artist to paint an 8 by 20 foot mural for the entryway of your rented flat is not ostentatious. But
Right. Well, Duchamp is credited with convincing Peggy Guggenheim that she should let Pollock paint it on a canvas, the canvas that Laura described, so that it could be taken down, stretched, removed from it should she leave this residence, right?
That's right. In fact, it was stretched and primed and painted mostly, if not exclusively, in Pollock's studio. By that time, he and Lee Krasner have gotten together, and in order to stretch Mural, they have to take the wall down in Pollock's apartment between the living room and the bedroom. And they do this in the middle of the night because, of course, they don't want to get evicted for tearing down a wall in their rental apartment. There's one amazing photograph of Pollock standing with his shadow on the stretched canvas, which fills the apartment pretty much from floor to ceiling. And it is both important in a logistical sense that Peggy Guggenheim was only in New York because of the war, having left her beloved Europe for the United States because World War II broke out. Duchamp knew that she was going to move back to Europe as soon as the war ended and convinced her to have the painting painted on canvas. But I think that Duchamp was also perhaps thinking about a type of art that was something in the size of a mural, but portable like an easel, which to a degree is what the New York school painters, the abstract expressionists, Pollock and company, ended up creating in the 40s and 50s.
There was a lot of conversation as to whether it was painted on the floor or on the wall. We all were thinking of Pollock as a guy who paints on the floor, not on a stretched canvas on the wall. Maybe Alan could tell us how it was you determined that it was painted on the wall.
Yes, I think there are two things that point to it being painted upright in the vertical position. One is just the simple geography of the studio. It simply wouldn't have been possible to lay the painting on the floor and for him
because
to be able to move around.
Because you knew the floor plan of the studio, you knew the size of the studio, you could make that determination?
Roughly, yes. And with an 8-foot by 20-foot painting laid flat horizontally on the floor, there simply wouldn't have been the space around it for him to get access to it. And the physical evidence in the painting itself mainly comes from drips. He thinned the paint down considerably with turpentine, presumably. There's a very clear downwards flow of the paint across the surface, even to the point on the bottom edge where the fluid paint drips slightly onto the tacking margin as if it was leaning ever so slightly at an angle against the wall.
Which tacking margin we mean around the edge of the painting?
From the front of the painting around to the side of the stretcher, which would have been on a very slight downwards angle.
Is there a reason why he would have painted it on a stretcher as opposed to tacking it to the wall? Laura?
I think it was done on a stretcher because that allowed Pollock to have the feeling of the canvas moving. And if you have the canvas tacked to the wall, it's a very different experience in terms of how the canvas takes the paint from the brush. Without the movement of the canvas, you end up with a very different kind of stroke. If you're using a brush to paint on a hard surface, a canvas against the wall, versus a stretched canvas, which tends to move even as you walk by it.
I also think that he was firmly entrenched in the traditional methods in a way, and that is the way you paint in oil painting.
That way.
He was trained that way. I don't think it would have felt right to him to be painting this great important commission with the canvas just tacked on the wall. That stretching the canvas falls very firmly into the tradition of oil painting on canvas.
Yeah. We know that he writes to his brother shortly after giving the commission, and he says to his brother that it's going to be a certain size of painting. And then we know that he's exhibited the following November in an exhibition and that he was well received. And then Peggy Guggenheim writes to a friend and notes Pollock's exhibition in that November and says that he's painted a 20-foot mural in my house in the entrance, suggesting, because of the word she used, painted, that it's finished in November. You're now assembling all the documents and the photographs and so forth. You're trying to track down how it proceeded over time, how he painted the picture. What do you make of what seems to be, you assume, an accurate literary account that the painting was completed by November, when we know that it wasn't?
It's really a fascinating story. I mean, that postcard is the only evidence that exists of anyone seeing the painting completed before the holidays of 1943, 1944. And in fact, there's no record of anyone, which is the great research that Angelica Rudenstein has done, saying that they saw the painting in situ in Peggy Guggenheim's apartment until 1945. So we really have tried the best we can to construct what happened between 1943 in the summer, where he begins the commission, and 1945, which people are invited to Peggy Guggenheim's house after an opening at Art of the Century Gallery to see Mural.
And why is that important?
The myth was that Pollock was overwhelmed by the ambition, by the size of this 8 by 20 foot blank canvas, and really didn't know how to start, how to do it. And after months of really being blocked, he finally painted it in one 24-hour burst.
I guess I had forgotten or never quite understood that one could still accept this myth and have it first photographed in 1946. Is there actual visual evidence that can counter the myth of a 24-hour account of the making of the picture?
Yes, there's one extremely important tripartite photograph, or a photograph that is actually 3 photographs because the painting was too large. They've broken the 8 by 20 foot canvas into 3 photographs, which we think are all taken at the same moment, probably in Pollock's studio.
So how does that tell us that it wasn't painted in 24 hours?
Well, here I'm going to turn things over to Alan, because there are quite a few changes to the painting from the moment of the photograph to the painting that we see today.
Yeah, so the 3 photographs, which are in black and white, unfortunately, I think show the painting at the first stage of completion, at the end of what we've called the main solidification phase. But after these black and white photographs were taken, the mural received a further retouching campaign at some point to bring it to a final state of absolute finish. But I think to go back to the sort of myth of it being painted in one drunken evening, the first thing that goes against that as a plausible explanation is that it's painted in oil. Virtually all the paints that we analysed on Mural were oil paints, traditional artist oil, probably bought in tubes from an artist colourman. And oil, one of its key characteristics, it takes a long time to dry. Depending on the pigment that's present, it can take a day, several days, possibly even a week or more. So there's a lot of paint on Mural and a lot of layers on Mural. And just in terms of the speed of drying, it wouldn't have been conceivable to put all those separate multiple layers on in such a short period of time without there being much more intermingling of one layer with the ones that have already been put on.
But there's another story to this, and that has to do with the life after Peggy Guggenheim returns to Venice, and the painting then leaves her lobby or townhouse and goes elsewhere. Tell us that story.
Well, I think she knows she's going to be leaving New York, which is one of the reasons the painting is taken down from the townhouse and shipped to the Museum of Modern Art, where it's shown in this important exhibition of large-scale painting. She then, soon after that, moves to Venice and offers the painting to Yale University, which was the most prominent art school in the United States at that time. And Yale agrees to take it, but seems extremely unenthusiastic about it. They keep it mostly rolled up in a storeroom and not on view for nearly 2 years, which angers Peggy tremendously. And she finally ends up meeting an art professor from the University of Iowa who essentially says to her, I can't believe Yale is keeping this masterpiece rolled up and out of view, and we would be extremely happy to have it. So Peggy writes to Yale and says, if you're not going to show this painting, treat it respectfully, then I'm going to give it to the University of Iowa. She ends up giving it to the University of Iowa, where it's hung very high on the wall in the painting studio where painting instruction is taught. And you can see some fabulous photographs of students with very small easels working on small figurative paintings with the giant abstract murals sort of looming over them.
Since 1951, Mural has lived at the University of Iowa, first in its painting studio, then in the main library, and finally in the collection of the university's Museum of Art. To hear the second part of this 2-part series about Mural, visit getty.edu/podcast, where you can also find all of our past Art and Ideas podcast episodes, as well as access images, transcripts, and other resources. Our theme music comes from the Dharma at Big Sur, composed by John Adams for the opening of the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles in 2003. It is licensed with permission from Hendon Music. Look for new episodes of Arts and Ideas every other Wednesday. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Google Play Music. Thanks for listening.